Hey folks, I'm John Lee and welcome back to my channel. Alright, so a little under 2 weeks ago, there was a tweet that was written by Noah Smith. Now, for those of you who do not know who Noah Smith is, he is an opinion columnist who works at Bloomberg. Now, in the tweet that he wrote, it was an unscientific poll that he was conducting, and he asked the question if it was right for the US to intervene in the Korean War that took place from 1950 to 1953. Now, about 50% of the respondents said that it was right for the US to intervene in the war, about 15% said no, and the rest seemed to be unsure as to whether it was right or not. Now, why was this question being asked? I don't know if it was trying to prove a point, but anyway, the point is that this survey, this poll is being conducted on Twitter, so it's not at all scientific. But it was an interesting question nonetheless, because after he asked this question, he asked a similar question for two other wars that the US got itself involved in. And the other two wars were the first Persian Gulf War from 1990, and the next one was the Libyan Civil War. Now, again, when the respondents were asked about whether or not it was right for the US to get involved in the Persian Gulf War, an even higher percentage of people said that it was right for the US to intervene, about 55%. But when it came to the third war, the Libyan Civil War, there were more people who said that it was not right for the US to get involved in the war than those who said that it was right. And so, what does this all mean? Well, the thing about war is that whether or not a war is just or not is something that has been debated by philosophers for centuries, if not millennia. Sure, if we are talking about something like the Second World War, where the Allies had to fight against Nazi Germany, yeah, that was a just war. But if we are talking about a war of choice, like the coalition of the willing that invaded Iraq in the 2000s, that might not be as just as the Second World War. But regardless of whether a war is just or not, what is true is that all wars are evil. It doesn't matter if it can be justified. It leads to people dying, it leads to ruined lives, it leads to ruined economies. Even if a war is just, wars are always evil. But let's talk about this one specific topic, this specific kind of war that Noah Smith was bringing up. All of these wars that Noah Smith was talking about was a war of choice. America was not attacked or invaded by the North Koreans or by the Iraqis or by the Libyans. These were wars that America intervened in on behalf of other countries. And so the question is, was it right for the US to intervene in those wars? Now, I'm of two minds of this. Firstly, I'm a South Korean citizen, and so because America came to Korea to defend South Korea against North Korean and Chinese aggression, as a South Korean citizen, I am eternally grateful that the United States came to South Korea's aid. I probably would not exist if America had not come to South Korea's aid in 1950. But that's from my own completely biased South Korean perspective. The second thing that I think about this topic, this war of intervention, on whether or not it is right or not, I think really comes down to one thing. And that thing is the result of the war. Specifically, whether or not the war is won or lost. I think that is what really determines whether it is right to intervene in a war or not. So let's take the Korean War, for example. Now, the US did not win the Korean War. The Korean War was a stalemate. It wasn't a victory like it was in the Second World War, and it wasn't a loss like in Vietnam. It was a stalemate. But the important thing is that although it was a stalemate, eventually, over time, North and South Korea both developed and progressed in their own ways. And fast forward about 70 years, and we can very much easily see that between the two Koreas, South Korea clearly won. It has the larger population, it has the much larger economy, it has the much larger military, it has better everything than North Korea does. And that's in spite of the fact that North Korea started out much richer than South Korea did. And much of it was due to the fact that America offered South Korea military protection from its neighbors. And from that point, from that perspective, the fact that America helped to protect South Korea is one of America's, if not America's absolute best foreign policy goal. It helped to change a country from a backwater colony that no one in the world had ever heard of, into one of the largest and most richest countries today. South Korea officially now has the 10th largest GDP in the world, and that is saying something considering the fact that only a few generations ago, Koreans could barely feed their own kids. Now, we also have to mention that South Korea was not always a democracy. South Korea, in its early days, was very much a right wing dictatorship. It just wasn't communist, that was all. But over time, South Korea, through, I don't know, maybe divine intervention or providence, or because of the plucky spirit of the Korean people, or what have you, for many different reasons that combine into one serendipitous series of events, Korea went from a right wing dictatorship to a democracy. And so that probably helps Americans feel much more justified in having defended South Korea and having gotten involved in the Korean War. Let's say that the Korean Peninsula is still divided today as it is, but South Korea is not the vibrant democracy that it is today. Let's assume for a moment that South Korea is more similar to the military junta that is in Myanmar right now. It's still a right wing dictatorship. South Korea is still poor. The only difference is that South Korea is not communist and an American ally. Would Americans still be as satisfied about having gotten involved in the Korean War if that was what South Korea looked like today? I think that a lot more Americans would say that no, it was not right, that it was more of a mistake to get involved in the Korean War. Korea was a success. The war might not have been won, but South Korea itself is a success, and that is why I think that because it ended up so well, that justified the intervention. Now let's talk about the First Persian Gulf War. Now, the First Persian Gulf War was a somewhat more traditional kind of war, in the sense that it was a war between nations, there was no insurgency, there was no terrorism, and there were very clear and specific goals. The goal was simple: to kick Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein's control, and that was very much easily achieved by the United States and her allies. The Iraqi forces were quickly routed. In fact, a lot of their tanks were completely obliterated by American stealth bombers. And yeah, Saddam Hussein was not forced to abdicate. There was no regime change. That came later. And that led to a whole lot of mess later, but that's a different story. But at least as far as the First Persian Gulf War was concerned, the objectives were very simple. It was a quick and easy victory. And so because of that, a lot of people seem to think that it was justified. But on the other hand, the Libyan civil war is nowhere near as clean as the First Persian Gulf War was. At least in the First Persian Gulf War, there was a very easily obtainable objective: just to kick Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. But here in the Libyan civil war, it's all messy. There is no border, there is no different flags, there are no identifiable armies with uniforms. It is just one immensely huge and uncontrollable humanitarian disaster. And because the war is such a disaster, because there is no end in sight, there's no victory in sight, there's no possible objective that could be realistically achieved by a traditional army, the support for that war is not that high. Now, another war that we should mention that Noah Smith did not mention in his polls was the Vietnam War. Now, the Vietnam War was the first major military loss that America suffered in the 20th century. Now, when this war happened, because the Vietnam War was such a disaster for the United States military and American foreign policy, there arose things like the Vietnam Syndrome. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Vietnam Syndrome isn't as anything as concrete as a policy, but more of a public sentiment. Starting in the 1970s, more and more Americans became skeptical of getting involved in foreign wars. And that was what the Vietnam Syndrome was all about: not wanting to get involved in foreign wars. Now, let's talk very briefly again about the Korean War. The Korean War was a stalemate. But whereas in Vietnam, no matter how much the President Nixon tried to say that it was trying to end the war with honor, the Vietnam War was still a total loss. And because that war was a total loss, Americans don't believe that getting involved in that war was just or right. They believe that it was a mistake to get involved in that war. So, going back to the original question, was it right for the US to get involved in the Korean War? Again, as a Korean citizen, I do believe that it was right for the US to get involved in that war. Had the US not made that decision, I probably would not exist today. But the fact of the matter is that when we're talking about this objectively, for a country to get involved in another country's war, and the question of whether or not it is right or not, I believe that there are many factors at play. I believe that there are questions of humanitarian grounds. There are questions about whether or not the war is strictly a political calculation or whether it is about saving someone else's lives or whether or not it is about establishing democracy or fighting against dictatorship. I believe that there are many different possible reasons. But the cold hard truth is that when we're talking just simply about a country's national interests, I believe that for many countries, it is only right to get involved in a foreign country's war if there is a guaranteed success of victory. But I don't know, that's just my thought. What do you think? Was it right for the US to get involved in the Korean War, or in the Gulf War, or in the Vietnam War, or in the Libyan Civil War? If you have an opinion, leave it down below, and I'll make sure to read it, and I'll even answer back. And I might even feature some of your answers in a future video. Alright, so if you like this video, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe button. Don't forget to click on the notification bell. And like I said, leave a comment. I'm John Lee, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.